I paid $30,000 for my son's wedding. He mocked my pathetic business in front of 200 guests until the bride's boss took the mic. Welcome back to another episode of Story Threads podcast. My name is Emma, and today I'm here with Diana, who came all the way from Denver, Colorado to share today's absolutely unbelievable story. Before we get started, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for being here.
Emma, thank you for having me here today. Let me tell you what happened at my son's wedding last month. Picture this. I'm sitting at this gorgeous reception venue, crystal chandeliers everywhere, 200 guests dressed to the nines. I just watched my boy Michael marry the love of his life, Sarah, and I was feeling so proud. Then Michael grabs the microphone for what I thought would be a sweet thank you speech to the families. Instead, he looks right at me and says, "I want to talk about my mom for a minute. She's going through what I guess you'd call a late life crisis." The whole room starts chuckling. At 62, she decided she wants to be some kind of business mogul. He actually used air quotes, Emma. Air quotes. We keep telling her to act her age, but she just won't listen to us. I'm sitting there with this frozen smile, dying inside while 200 people are laughing at what they think is my pathetic midlife crisis. My own son, at the wedding I secretly paid half of, is roasting me in front of everyone. But here's the thing nobody knew, including Michael. While they're all laughing at the crazy old lady trying to play entrepreneur, the most powerful person in that room was sitting quietly at table 12. Because what happened next involved Sarah's boss standing up, nearly choking on his champagne, and saying 5 words that changed absolutely everything. See, 3 years ago I was Diana Mitchell, 62, recently divorced, feeling completely lost after being laid off from my office manager job of 30 years. They called it restructuring, but we all know what that really means. Replacing older employees with younger, cheaper ones. For the first time in decades, I was truly on my own. Michael was 34, living with Sarah, constantly treating me like I was this fragile thing that needed protecting. My ex-husband had already moved on to someone 20 years younger, because apparently that's what men do during their actual midlife crisis. And there I was, sitting in my small apartment wondering what the hell I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. That's when I made a choice. I could either accept that my best years were behind me, or I could decide that 3 decades of keeping offices running smoothly might actually be worth something. I started DM consulting, helping small companies with operations and efficiency. Nothing flashy, just using everything I'd learned over 30 years. The problem was, nobody in my family took it seriously. Michael would roll his eyes every time I mentioned a client meeting. "Mom, you're 62, not 23. Maybe it's time to be realistic about what you can actually accomplish," he'd say. Sarah was even worse, constantly trying to explain basic business concepts to me like I was a child playing dress-up. But I was actually killing it, Emma. Really killing it. My clients were thriving, my contracts were growing, I was making more money than I ever had. But every time I tried to share good news with my family, they'd pat me on the head like I was a toddler who'd managed to tie her shoes. When Michael was planning his wedding, he made it crystal clear he didn't want me talking about my little business to Sarah's colleagues. "Please don't embarrass us by telling people you're some kind of entrepreneur," he said. "Just say you're between jobs or something." I agreed because I loved my son and wanted his day to be perfect. But sitting there listening to him make jokes about my supposed delusions while I'd quietly contributed $30,000 to their dream wedding, money they assumed came from my divorce settlement rather than my thriving business, I realized something devastating. My family wasn't just unsupportive. They were actively ashamed of me for refusing to fade quietly into middle-aged invisibility. And what hurt most was watching Michael's face during his speech. He wasn't embarrassed or trying to stop the laughter. He was enjoying it, nodding along like publicly humiliating his mother was perfectly acceptable entertainment. But what none of them knew, not Michael, not Sarah, not a single person laughing in that room, was that while they thought I was some delusional old woman playing at business, I'd actually built something extraordinary. Something that was about to make this the most satisfying moment of vindication in my entire life. Because you see, what happened when Sarah's boss realized exactly who I was? Well, let me tell you about my son Michael. 34 years old, works in marketing for some tech startup, and somehow convinced himself he's this big-shot business expert. Ever since his dad and I divorced 5 years ago, he's appointed himself the man of the family. You know the type. Suddenly thinks he needs to manage everyone else's life because he's the only one with any sense. Michael had always been a little controlling, but after the divorce it got so much worse. Every conversation turned into a lecture about what I should be doing with my life. Mom, you need to be realistic about your limitations at your age. Mom, you can't compete with people half your age. Mom, why don't you just find a nice part-time job at Target or something? The worst part was how he'd talk about me to Sarah, his fiancée. I'd overhear them sometimes when I visited their apartment. She's going through this weird phase where she thinks she's some kind of CEO, he'd tell her. We just have to be patient until she comes back to reality. Sarah would laugh and say things like, "Poor Diana, it's so sad when people can't accept their place in life." Their place in life. Like I was some kind of ancient relic who should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they allowed me to keep. But here's what really gets me, Emma. Michael had no problem accepting my help when it benefited him. When he needed a down payment for his condo, I quietly transferred $15,000 to his account. When Sarah's car broke down, I paid for the repairs. When they wanted to go on that expensive vacation to Europe, I covered their flights. But he never asked where the money was coming from. He just assumed it was from my divorce settlement or maybe some retirement fund. The idea that his delusional mother was actually earning this money through her thriving business never crossed his mind. Because in Michael's world, women my age don't build successful companies. We bake cookies and babysit grandchildren and gracefully fade into the background. The wedding planning was when everything really escalated. Sarah comes from this wealthy family. Her dad owns a chain of luxury car dealerships. Her mother runs some high-end interior design firm. They were planning this massive celebration, 200 guests at the Fairmont Hotel. Beautiful venue but expensive as hell. Michael comes to me one day looking all sheepish and says they need help with the costs. Sarah's parents were covering most of it, but there was still a $30,000 gap for flowers, photography, the upgraded dinner menu. I hate to ask, Mom, but do you think you could contribute something? Even just a few thousand would help. I wrote him a check for the full $30,000 that same day. His eyes nearly popped out of his head. Mom, where did you get this kind of money? I told him it was from a successful client project. He just stared at the check for a long moment, then shook his head and said, "Well, I guess your little consulting thing is doing better than I thought." Little consulting thing. That $30,000 came from a single contract I'd just completed, helping a mid-size manufacturing company streamline their operations. But to Michael, it was just my hobby that happened to generate some pocket money. The real kicker was what happened 2 weeks before the wedding. Michael and Sarah invited me to dinner to discuss expectations for the big day. They sat me down like I was a child about to be given rules for a field trip. "Mom, we need to talk about the wedding reception," Michael said. "Sarah's dad's business associates are going to be there, some really important people in the automotive industry. Her boss from the marketing firm she works for will be attending with his wife. These are serious professionals." Sarah jumps in, "We're just worried that if you start talking about your business ventures, it might come across as, well, a little embarrassing. Like you're trying too hard to impress people." Trying too hard to impress people. I'm sitting there having just paid for a third of their wedding, listening to them tell me I'm not sophisticated enough to mingle with their guests. "What we'd prefer," Michael continued, "is if you could just introduce yourself as retired or between careers. Something simple and dignified. We don't want people to think you're one of those desperate older women trying to relive their youth by playing entrepreneur." Playing entrepreneur. That's exactly how he said it, Emma. Like I was a kid with a lemonade stand. I nodded and smiled and told them I completely understood. I promised to keep any conversation about my work to a minimum. But inside I was dying. My own son was so ashamed of what he thought I was doing that he wanted me to lie about my life to avoid embarrassing him. What made it even worse was the way Sarah looked at me with this pitying expression. Like she felt sorry for Michael for having such a pathetic mother. "It's actually really sweet that you're trying to stay busy, Diana," she said. "A lot of women your age just give up and become bitter after a divorce. At least you're channeling your energy into something positive, even if it's not exactly realistic." Not exactly realistic. This woman who worked as a junior marketing coordinator for a small firm was telling me that my business dreams weren't realistic. The night before the wedding I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that conversation, about the way they'd looked at me, about how my own child was more concerned with his image than with supporting his mother. I'd spent 30 years raising Michael, sacrificing my own career ambitions to make sure he had every opportunity. And this was how he repaid me. But what they didn't know, what nobody in that family knew, was that 3 months earlier, I'd just closed the biggest deal of my career. I'd acquired a company called Sterling Solutions, a tech consulting firm with contracts all over the Southwest. The purchase price was $12 million. 12 million, Emma. Kish. While Michael was worried about me embarrassing him with my cute little business stories, I was running a company with 47 employees and annual revenues of $18 million. While Sarah was telling me to be realistic about my limitations, I was negotiating partnerships with Fortune 500 companies. And the most ironic part of all? Sarah's boss, the one who was going to be at the wedding, the one they were so worried about impressing? His name was Richard Conway and he ran Conway Marketing Solutions, a firm I'd been considering acquiring for the past 6 months. I'd done my research on Conway's company. I knew their client list, their revenue streams, their growth projections. I'd even had preliminary discussions with Richard's business partner about a potential buyout. But Richard himself had no idea who DM Consulting was, because I always conducted business through intermediaries and legal representatives. So here's this beautiful irony, Emma. My son was protecting his future mother-in-law's boss from having to meet his embarrassing entrepreneurial mother. But what he didn't know was that his embarrassing mother was probably going to be his mother-in-law's boss's boss within the next few months. The morning of the wedding, I got dressed carefully. Nothing too flashy, nothing that would draw attention away from the bride. I chose a simple navy dress, modest jewelry, low heels. I looked exactly like what everyone expected, a recently divorced woman in her 60s, trying to blend in at her son's fancy wedding. But as I was doing my makeup, looking at myself in the mirror, I made a decision. I was done hiding. I was done pretending to be smaller than I actually was just to make other people comfortable. If Michael wanted to be embarrassed by his mother, then maybe it was time he learned exactly who his mother really was. What I didn't expect was that the revelation would come not from me, but from the most unexpected source possible. Because sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about these things. And sometimes justice comes from directions you never saw coming. The wedding ceremony was absolutely beautiful, Emma. Michael looked so handsome in his tuxedo, Sarah was radiant in her dress, and I cried happy tears watching my son start this new chapter. During the cocktail hour, I mingled quietly, staying away from Sarah's work crowd just like they'd asked me to. But I couldn't help overhearing their conversations. These marketing people were discussing business strategies, client acquisitions, industry trends. I knew more about their sector than they probably realized, but I kept my mouth shut and smiled politely when introduced as the groom's mother. Then came the reception dinner, and that's when everything went sideways. The evening started perfectly, beautiful venue, great food, everyone in high spirits. Michael's best man gave a sweet speech about their friendship. Sarah's maid of honor talked about how perfect they were together. Standard wedding stuff, you know? But then Michael stood up with the microphone. I thought he was going to give a heartfelt thank you speech to both families. Instead, he looked right at me with this smug little grin and said, "I want to talk about my mom for a minute." The room got quiet, all expectant. "She's going through what I guess you'd call a late-life crisis." People started chuckling. At 62, she decided she wants to be some kind of business mogul. He actually used air quotes, Emma. In front of 200 people. We keep telling her to act her age, but she just won't listen to us. The laughter got louder. I sat there with this frozen smile, dying inside as my own son publicly mocked what he thought were my pathetic business dreams. But it got worse. "Mom's always talking about her big client meetings and her strategic partnerships," he continued, making those sarcastic quotes again. "We just nod and smile because, it's sweet that she's trying to stay relevant." Stay relevant. My 34-year-old son was telling a room full of people that his mother was desperately trying to stay relevant. Sarah was giggling in her wedding dress, clearly enjoying the show. Her parents were laughing too. Even the servers seemed amused as they collected dinner plates. But the absolute worst part was when Michael said, "We love supporting Mom's little hobby business, even though we know it's never going to amount to anything real. At her age, it's really more about keeping busy than actually accomplishing anything meaningful." The room erupted in laughter. 200 people all enjoying a good joke at my expense. I wanted to disappear under that table, Emma. My cheeks were burning with humiliation as everyone, including people I'd never met, laughed at the crazy old lady trying to play entrepreneur. That's when Sarah's boss, Richard Conway, leaned over to his wife and said loud enough for half our table to hear, "It's actually kind of sad when people can't accept their limitations. But good for her for trying, I guess." His wife nodded sympathetically. My mother went through something similar after my dad left. Started selling jewelry online, made maybe $300 the whole year. But it kept her occupied. I sat there listening to these people, successful business professionals, dismiss me as some kind of pitiful charity case. What made it even worse was that Richard Conway was unknowingly talking about his potential future boss like she was a delusional amateur. After Michael's speech, people started approaching me with that patronizing sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Good for you for staying active at your age," one of Sarah's aunts said, patting my shoulder like I was a brave little girl. "It's never too late to chase dreams, even small ones." Jake's work colleagues were the worst. When someone mentioned I was the entrepreneurial mother, they'd nod politely and immediately change the subject. I could see them thinking, "Oh, another middle-aged woman with a cute little side hustle." But the breaking point came when Sarah pulled me aside during the cake cutting. "Diana, thank you for being such a good sport about Michael's speech," she said. "I know he was just having fun, but I didn't want you to feel bad about your consulting thing." "My consulting thing?" This woman whose wedding I'd paid for was calling my $12 million business empire my consulting thing. "You know," she continued, "it's actually inspiring that you're not giving up, even though it's probably not going to lead anywhere. Most women your age would have accepted reality by now." Accepted reality. I stared at this 28-year-old marketing coordinator who thought she was giving me life advice. "Sarah," I said carefully, "what exactly do you think I do?" He shrugged. "Some kind of small business consulting. Michael said you help local shops with their bookkeeping or something." "Which is nice. Every little bit helps when you're starting over at your age." Local shops. Bookkeeping. Starting over at my age. That $30,000 check I'd written for her perfect wedding? That came from a single consulting contract worth more than she'd earn in 3 years. "The important thing," Sarah added with that same pitying smile, "is that you're keeping busy instead of becoming one of those bitter divorced women who just sit around complaining about their ex-husbands." I excused myself to the bathroom where I sat in a stall trying not to cry. My own family thought I was some kind of pathetic amateur playing at business. They had no idea that in the past 18 months, I'd acquired 3 companies and was in negotiations for 2 more. Including, potentially, the company where Richard Conway worked. When I came back out, I overheard Michael talking to one of his groomsmen near the bar. "Yeah, Mom's been really lost since the divorce," he was saying. "This whole business thing is just her way of feeling important again. We don't have the heart to tell her it's never going to be anything real." "That's rough, man," his friend replied. "But at least she's not dating again. Can you imagine bringing some random guy to family dinner?" They both laughed and something inside me finally snapped. This wasn't just about being underestimated anymore. My own son genuinely believed I was a pathetic middle-aged woman desperately grasping for relevance while he paid for his lifestyle with money from my imaginary business. I stood there in that beautiful reception hall, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and people in formal wear, and I made a decision. I was done hiding. I was done pretending to be smaller than I actually was just to make other people comfortable. If Michael wanted to be embarrassed by his mother, then maybe it was time he learned exactly who his mother really was. But what I didn't expect was that the revelation would come not from me, but from the most unexpected source possible. Because while Michael was busy humiliating me, he had no idea that the most powerful person in that room was about to stand up and change everything. You see, Richard Conway had just received a text message. And when he read it, his face went completely white. So Richard Conway is staring at his phone and I can see the color draining from his face. His wife notices too and asks if everything's okay. He just shakes his head and puts his phone away, but he keeps glancing over at me with this strange expression. Meanwhile, Michael's still working the room, soaking up all the congratulations on his hilarious speech about his delusional mother. Sarah's giggling with her bridesmaids, probably sharing more jokes about how pathetic I am. They have no idea what's about to happen. But here's what I need to tell you about the weeks leading up to this wedding, Emma. While Michael was busy planning his big day and Sarah was choosing flowers, I was making some very interesting business moves. 3 months before the wedding, I'd started preliminary discussions about acquiring Conway Marketing Solutions. Richard's company was exactly the kind of firm I specialized in: mid-sized, profitable, but lacking the capital for major expansion. My lawyers had been in contact with Richard's business partner about a potential buyout. The irony was delicious. Here was Michael, desperately trying to impress his future mother-in-law's boss, while that same boss was unknowingly negotiating to sell his company to the woman Michael was publicly mocking. But it gets better. 2 weeks after Michael's little intervention about not embarrassing him at the wedding, I made my decision. I instructed my acquisition team to accelerate the Conway deal. I wanted it closed before the wedding. My lawyer thought I was crazy. "Diana, rushing a $12 million acquisition is never wise," he said. "What's the urgency?" I told him it was a strategic timing issue, which wasn't exactly a lie. The due diligence process was intense. Every night after Michael would call to give me more instructions about keeping quiet at his wedding, I'd be on conference calls with forensic accountants, reviewing Conway's financials, analyzing their client contracts, planning integration strategies. Michael had no idea that while he was worried about me embarrassing him with small talk about my consulting hobby, I was orchestrating the biggest deal of my career specifically to coincide with his wedding reception. The purchase agreement was signed exactly 1 week before the wedding. DM Consulting now owned Conway Marketing Solutions lock, stock, and barrel. Richard Conway was now my employee, though he didn't know it yet because the announcement wasn't scheduled to go public until the following Monday. But here's where it gets really interesting, Emma. The text message Richard had just received? It was from his business partner, informing him that their new owner wanted to attend a client meeting tomorrow morning. The message included my name, Diana Mitchell, CEO of DM Consulting. I watched Richard's face as he put the pieces together. His eyes went wide, then he looked at me, then at Michael, who was still basking in the laughter from his speech, then back at me. You could literally see the moment it clicked. Sarah's boss had just realized that the woman everyone was mocking as a delusional entrepreneur was actually his new boss. And not just his boss, the person who now controlled his career, his company, and his future. The beautiful thing was, I hadn't planned for Richard to find out at the wedding. That was pure cosmic justice. I'd been content to let the humiliation play out and reveal the truth later. But the universe had other plans. Richard stood up from his table, still staring at his phone. His wife grabbed his arm, asking what was wrong. Other people at his table started noticing the commotion. And that's when Richard did something I never expected. He walked over to the head table where Michael and Sarah were sitting, still glowing from their successful roast of the groom's pathetic mother. Richard tapped Michael on the shoulder and asked to speak with him privately. I watched from across the room as Richard pulled Michael aside and started talking urgently. Michael's expression went from confused to shocked to absolutely horrified. He kept glancing over at me, then back at Richard, who was showing him something on his phone. Sarah noticed the intense conversation and joined them. Soon all three were huddled together, with Richard doing most of the talking while Michael and Sarah looked like they'd seen a ghost. That's when I realized what was happening. Richard wasn't just keeping this revelation to himself. He was telling them exactly who I was and what it meant for their lives going forward. See, Emma, what Michael and Sarah didn't know was that Sarah's entire career was now in my hands. Her performance reviews, her salary, her future promotions, all of that would ultimately be decided by the woman they'd just spent the evening mocking as a sad, delusional has-been. I could see the panic setting in as Richard explained the situation. Michael kept running his hands through his hair, that same gesture he'd done as a kid when he was in trouble. Sarah looked like she was about to be sick. But the best part was watching them realize that everyone else at the wedding was still laughing and having a good time, completely unaware that the joke was now on them. They couldn't make a scene without explaining to 200 guests that they'd just publicly humiliated the woman who now controlled their professional lives. Richard finished his explanation and walked back to his table, leaving Michael and Sarah standing there looking absolutely devastated. They both turned to look at me, and for the first time all evening I allowed myself a small smile. That's when Michael started walking toward me with Sarah close behind. Both of them looked terrified, like children who'd been caught doing something awful and were about to face the consequences. But what they didn't realize was that the consequences were just beginning. Michael reached me first, with Sarah right behind him looking absolutely terrified. "Mom," he said in this panicked whisper, "we need to talk. Right now." I looked up at him with that same calm smile I'd been wearing all evening. "Of course, sweetheart. What's wrong? You both look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah grabbed my arm, her voice shaking. "Diana, Richard just told us something incredible. He said your company." She couldn't even get the words out. "What exactly did Richard tell you?" I asked, still maintaining that sweet, innocent tone. Michael was running his hands through his hair, that same nervous gesture from childhood. Mom, please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding. Richard says you own his company, that you're some kind of major business owner. That can't be true, right? I took a sip of my champagne, letting the moment hang in the air. Well, Michael, what would you like to know specifically? Everything. Sarah practically hissed, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. Richard says you're Dee Mitchell of DM Consulting, that you just bought Conway Marketing Solutions for $12 million. $12 million, Diana. The panic in her voice was delicious, Emma. Here was this woman who'd been calling my work a cute hobby, suddenly realizing her entire career was in my hands. That's correct, I said simply. I closed the acquisition last week. Michael's face went completely white. But you drive an old Honda. You live in that tiny apartment. You said you were just doing small consulting work. I never said small, honey. You assumed small because you thought I was too old and incapable to accomplish anything significant. That's when Richard Conway appeared at our table, looking extremely uncomfortable. Miss Mitchell, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I feel like there's been a terrible misunderstanding tonight. I had no idea who you were when. It's fine, Richard, I said calmly. Really? But he wasn't fine. He was clearly panicking, running his hand through his hair. Ma'am, with all due respect, what's happened here tonight isn't right. The way people have been talking to you, treating you like... He looked around the room where people were still laughing and having a good time, completely unaware of the drama unfolding. Richard, please don't worry about it. I chose not to correct anyone. But you shouldn't have had to endure that, he said, his voice getting louder. Do you realize that half the people in this room work for companies in your portfolio? The way they've been mocking your business dreams when you literally own their employers. Other people at nearby tables were starting to notice our intense conversation. I could see curious faces turning our way, probably wondering why the bride's boss was having such a serious discussion with the groom's embarrassing mother. That's when Richard made a decision that changed everything. You know what? People need to know this. And before I could stop him, he was walking toward the DJ booth where the microphone was set up. Excuse me, everyone. Richard's voice boomed across the reception hall. The music stopped. All conversation ceased. 200 people turned to look at him with curious expressions. Michael grabbed my arm. Mom, what is he doing? Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting the festivities, but I need to address a serious misunderstanding that's occurred tonight. The room was dead silent now. I could feel every eye in the place starting to turn toward our table. Rachel was staring at Richard with confusion, probably wondering why her new husband's boss was making an impromptu speech. You see, we've all been treating the mother of the groom as if she were some kind of amateur dabbling in business as a hobby. We've been patronizing her, dismissing her accomplishments, and frankly, we've been incredibly rude. Gasps started echoing around the room. Someone dropped a fork. I heard Sarah make a small choking sound. What we didn't realize, Richard's voice grew stronger, is that Diana Mitchell is actually Dee Mitchell, the founder and CEO of DM Consulting. She's one of the most successful entrepreneurs in our industry. The silence was deafening. Then all hell broke loose. What? Michael shrieked, loud enough that everyone heard him. People started talking all at once. I saw the Hendersons frantically whispering to each other. They'd been among the most condescending about my cute little business venture. Furthermore, Richard continued, clearly on a roll now, I need to point out that roughly half the people in this room actually work for companies that Miss Mitchell now owns. So when we've been making jokes about her unrealistic business dreams, we've essentially been mocking our own boss. That's when the real panic set in. I watched executives and employees frantically trying to remember every dismissive comment they'd made to me throughout the evening. The man who'd compared me to his crafting aunt looked like he was about to be sick. Michael was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, complete shock mixed with something that might have been horror. Mom, he said, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise. Is this true? Before I could answer, Richard spoke again. I think Miss Mitchell should be the one to respond to that question. He gestured for me to come to the microphone. 200 people fell silent again, all waiting for my response. This was definitely not how I'd planned to spend my son's wedding reception. But after the evening I'd had, I wasn't entirely upset about it. I walked slowly to the microphone, feeling every eye in the room following me. When I reached it, I looked out at all those faces. Some shocked, some confused, some absolutely terrified. Well, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room, yes, it's true. I am D. Mitchell of DM Consulting. The room erupted again, but I kept talking. I know this comes as a surprise to many of you, especially my family. I've deliberately kept a low profile because I prefer to let my work speak for itself. I looked directly at Michael, who was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Honey, I didn't tell you because you specifically asked me not to talk about my business tonight. You were embarrassed by what you thought was my little consulting hobby, so I respected your wishes and stayed quiet. My voice was steady, but I could feel the emotion building. When you gave your speech earlier about my late life crisis and how I should act my age, you were talking about a business that employs over 200 people across multiple companies. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. When you said I was being unrealistic about what I could accomplish, you were referring to accomplishments that have already happened. In the past 18 months, I've acquired 4 companies, including the one where Richard works. Michael finally found his voice. Mom, I had no idea. I'm so sorry for everything I said. I feel like such an idiot. But I wasn't done yet. The floodgates had opened and everything I'd been holding back all evening came pouring out. Michael, I said, my voice carrying across that silent room, you assumed that a woman my age couldn't possibly know more about business than you do. That's worth thinking about. I looked around at all those shocked faces. When you gave your speech about my late life crisis, you were talking about a business that employs over 200 people. When you said I should act my age and be realistic, you were referring to accomplishments that have already happened. Sarah looked absolutely devastated, and not in a good way. She wasn't proud or excited about my success. She looked mortified that she'd been so publicly wrong. Mom, she whispered, why didn't you tell me? Because every time I tried to share good news about my business, you'd change the subject. You told me I was having a midlife crisis. You said my dreams had expiration dates. You asked me not to embarrass you by talking about my work. The room was still dead silent. I could see people frantically trying to remember every dismissive comment they'd made about the delusional old lady. 6 months later, everything had changed. Michael started calling me Miss Mitchell at family dinners and actually asking for my business advice. Funny how respect appears when job security depends on it. Sarah? Well, her performance reviews now crossed my desk. Amazing how quickly attitudes shift when success becomes undeniable. The best part was that 3 wedding guests approached me afterward about consulting contracts. Apparently, being publicly revealed as a business powerhouse is excellent marketing. These days, when people ask about my late life career change, I just smile. Because at 62, I've learned the most important business lesson of all. Never underestimate a woman who's decided she's done being underestimated. My son tried to humiliate me at the wedding I paid for. But what he gave me instead was the perfect stage to show everyone exactly who I really am.
Thank you for sharing this with us. And did you enjoy today's story? Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Story Threads podcast for more amazing stories. See you next time.